Hello, hello, Garland here. We're going to talk about woke culture, cancel culture. I knew it was just a matter of time before that was weaponized as a tool of the ruling class, a tool of the ruling elite. Who didn't see that coming? So that's what we're going to talk about next. Cancel culture, woke cancel, foreign policy, and how these things are used as tools of the ruling elite class. Let's talk. Hello, one and all. Garland Nixon here again, and it is about 10:13 here in Maryland on the beautiful shores of the Chesapeake Bay in Anne Arundel County, Pasadena area, and we're going to have a Saturday night talk. And woke culture, cancel culture, foreign policy. What's all that crap, and how's it go together? Let's start here. The concept of woke or wokeness has come out over the last few years, and I never, very early, I had a lot of question marks in my head. What in the world woke? What does that mean? And I started to see it materialize over time, and I'm sure so have you. So the what is implied in woke culture and cancel culture? It's implied that it's done for the good. It is implied, and I'll put it like this: it's another version of that kind of Manichaean way of way of seeing the world. The George W. Bush, you're either with us or with the terrorists. Manichaean being the Manichaean perspective is this: in the universe, there is a constant battle, and the battle is between pure good and pure evil. What you will find out, the self serving nature of the Manichaean view of the universe, is that everybody who takes that position always says, oh, by the way, I'm on the side of pure good. And those who disagree with me are on the side of pure evil. So what happens is that's transferred then. That perspective of good versus evil is then transferred into the social sphere. And now what we look at it now, it gets to this. I'm for the fair treatment of minority groups, and I'm for a society where everyone's treated equally and we all act lovingly towards each other. And that's where things go bad. It then gets bastardized. So if you believe like Garland, and so many of us believe, and I believe a lot of us, unfortunately, there are some that don't believe that. But if you believe like me, you say all human beings should have the same expectation of rights. How's that? Another way of putting that is rule of law. The term rule of law means if there's a law, everyone has to observe it in the same way and it's applied to everyone equally, right? So if you say rule of law, then what is the alternative to rule of law? The alternative to rule of law is, because rule of law implies fairness, everybody's treated the same. The alternative is what? Arbitrary application of the law, that the rules are applied to you depending on your social or economical station in life, right? Feudalism, if you think about feudalism, what was feudalism? You were born in a particular class, the noble class, the peasant class, the commoners class, right? And even people's names were basically like you were a blacksmith, your last name might be Black, things of that nature, implied your class. So when people heard your last name, they knew what class you were in. And your expectation of rights was based on the class that you were born in. And that didn't change. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. If you were born a commoner or born a nobleman, you remained in that class. And that's why people had terms like marrying up or marrying down. That meant you were marrying someone in a lower socioeconomic class, right? So the feudal way of seeing the world, the hierarchical way of seeing the world, right, is certain people have certain expectations of rights depending on where they were born. And it could be any number of things. Are you white or black, or are you a particular religion? Or in India, they have a very, very strong caste system. And so there's various formal, they have a formal caste system. In America, we have an informal caste system, right? I'm getting all of this, getting all that in to say that the issue of woke culture, it's kind of a fraud. It implies that we want to make sure everyone's treated the same, and we believe that everyone should be treated exactly the same. That is what's implied by woke culture. That is the what would be considered the cover story, the exoteric story. The esoteric story is the inside story. The exoteric is the outside story, right? The outside story is woke culture, or being woke, is all about making sure that everybody's treated the same, right? But what is it? How do they do that? Because the question is, if somebody tells me I'm doing something, right, I'm going to ask them, how does what you're doing get us there? So if you're like, my thing is everybody should be treated the same, there's an obvious question. How does woke culture get us there? Well, when we really look at this woke thing, it is very much related to cancel culture. Woke culture and cancel culture are the woke culture is the perspective of it. Cancel culture is the execution of woke culture, right? So woke culture is we have to believe certain things about the treatment of and the discussion of what's considered minority groups or oppressed groups. That's the woke culture. The cancel culture is if we determine that someone has violated the rules, and they're unwritten rules of woke culture, then the cancel culture is that's how they are then punished. So in reality, the problem with woke culture is it's not about an assertive way to fix it. It's not about, look, this person is not treating people fairly, or he has a kind of a view of whatever group it is that you feel that he has an oppressive view of. How do we talk to the person? How do we maybe chat with them? How do we find out their perspective? How do we treat them with love? And there's my brother Caleb. How do we treat them with dignity and respect, and try to figure out how to make it a better society, and understanding that everybody's not going to see things the same, right? So woke culture is the perspective, I think, that implies we treat everybody the same. But cancel culture is where what's real about it. That's how it's executed. It works like this. Garland Nixon has violated one of the woke rules, their unwritten rules. In foreign policy, it's the rules-based order. They're informal, unwritten rules that can be changed at any time by those who execute the rules and who claim to be able to make the rules. So the cancel culture is, this is what we do. This is your punishment. This is your punishment. And your punishment is social execution. No one, if you've got a job, if you're an artist, then you're not allowed to draw. Nobody buys your stuff anymore. If you're an actor, then you get fired. You can't get movies anymore. You're thrown off of social media. You're attacked. You're made a pariah. You're thrown out of our social groups. You become a person that no one speaks of, talks of. You become he who shall not be named. So cancel culture is the execution of woke culture. But remember, in the U.S. foreign policy, there's a term rules-based order that you'll hear, and I'm gonna bring those two together. Rules-based order. You'll hear our Secretary of State Tony Blinken talk about this country violated the rules-based order, right? And you'll hear maybe a China or Russia or other countries say international law. Right? International law is written. We can point to the law and say, there it is, you violated or you didn't. Rules-based order is an arbitrary application of informal, unwritten rules that are made up as they go along. And in fact, let me give you an example of rules-based order. A rules-based order is Russia can't invade their neighbor. The U.S. can invade Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan. It's blah, blah, blah. It's an arbitrary application of the law. And there's no nuance. You don't get a trial. You don't get to present your case. In woke/cancel culture, if you're accused of being transphobic, Joe Rogan's transphobic, there is no place for Joe Rogan to come forward. There is no place for him to bring his case. because it's all informal, and say, well, I'm not transphobic. Let me hear the charges. You're charged with being transphobic because you said X, 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 X. And then Joe Rogan would then say, let me present my defense. No, that's the power of woke culture. That's why the ruling elite love woke culture, because there's no way to defend yourself. There's no court. It's so X person Garland is accused of being fill in the blank, transphobic. He's transphobic, therefore he must be canceled. And there's no place for Garland to say. And if Garland says, "Hey, wait a minute, can't I?" And let me add this. And the assertion, the allegation of a woke crime is also the trial and the conviction. So all they have to say is Garland's transphobic. From then that point on, with the assertion, everybody acts based on the fact that Garland's transphobic. How do we know? Because the assertion was made in the court of public woke culture. Well, let's go to our foreign policy. Anthony Blinken or Joe, whoever, Biden, whoever says country X is fill in the blank. That's all you need, even if the evidence points otherwise, because we know that the defendant is guilty because they were accused. So woke culture is not about, that's the thing about it. Woke culture is not about making the world a better place. Woke culture is not about making minority or oppressed groups, giving them an opportunity to live a better life or live a fair or be treated fairly. In reality, if you get down to it, the woke culture, cancel culture, is about smiting one's enemies. Let me give an example. I'll name three people: Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. Right? Donald Trump is accused of misogyny and racism. Right? And he just gives you the finger. Screw you, drop dead. Bernie Sanders, a guy who was arrested during the civil rights movement, a guy who, I mean, to call Bernie Sanders a sexist misogynist is absurd, but he was an enemy of the ruling elite. So they made the assertion. And to this day, you'll have people who stand for the ruling elite, people who stand for the status quo, repeated to this day. Bernie's a misogynist and a sexist. Why? Because the assertion was made by the ruling elite, and therefore he's guilty. So the ruling elite, the liberal elite class, at least the liberal elite class didn't like Trump, so Trump's a misogynist or racist. The liberal elite class didn't like Bernie, so Bernie's a misogynist or racist. Now let's go to Joe Biden. Joe Biden has a history of questionable behavior when it comes to people of the opposite sex. There's untold video and anecdotes of him sniffing people's hair and grabbing all over little girls and people pushing them away from their children. And there is a credible assertion by a former staffer that he, to some extent, sexually assaulted her. Now, at a time when woke culture took all allegations, remember this, believe women. That's how absurd woke culture was. And that was all you needed to know. Believe women meant this: if a woman makes an assertion of sexual harassment or inappropriate behavior against a man, it should be accepted without a trial, without question. In fact, if you question the assertion, then in fact, you were guilty of a woke crime also. Here's the problem with that: it was applied arbitrarily. It wasn't a rule of law, it was arbitrary application of the law or the rule. What happened when Tara Reade came forward and made a credible allegation of a sexual assault against Joe Biden? The same people who, I forgot the name of the organization. There was an organization that was doing all the woke culture, cancel culture stuff when it came to sexual harassment, the Me Too organization. And it was getting a lot of money from Joe Biden's campaign. And when the allegations were made against Joe Biden, Tara Reade went to the organization and they said, no, we're not taking yours. And in fact, a whole bunch of people like women stars and things of that nature who had been at the forefront of the Me Too movement suddenly started going on their Twitter pages and erasing things that would have been damaging to Joe Biden, or that would have demonstrated their hypocrisy when it came to Joe Biden, as opposed to other people who had those allegations. Why is that? Because it was a fraud all along. It's a tool to smite your enemies. If in fact it was a valid let's just use the word system to make life better for those who would be oppressed, then it would invite transparency is the best what is it? Sunshine is the best disinfectant. It would invite questions, and every allegation would be treated the same. Remember, they at the time they were saying believe women. Okay, Tara Reid comes forth. I got a complaint against Joe Biden. Boom, Tara Reid killed the um the Me Too movement because she made a complaint against a person. And remember, woke culture and cancel culture is only used to smite your enemies, or sometimes a person who may not be your enemy, but you can sacrifice them for the cause, right? Alan, what's his name? The comedian from Minnesota, who was a senator, Al Franken. He wasn't necessarily their enemy, but he was somebody that they could sacrifice for the cause. He was just sacrificed for the cause, right? But Joe Biden at the time, it was like, we got to stop Trump, and we don't really believe in this crap, but it sure is handy for smiting our enemies. And boom, we better time to end this Me Too stuff, and time to just we'll put Me Too on pause. That was it. It was Me Too unless you're blue. And even Al Franken was blue. But people will ask why they do Al Franken. In fact, Al Franken was really good for the Me Too cause because he was on their side. They could sacrifice him and then give themselves more credibility. They could sacrifice him and say, look, we really are genuine. We just took out one of our own. He was a sacrificial lamb. They cut his head off just to make themselves look good. Okay. And let's face it, he had been going along with that stuff before that. And anybody, John Conyers, they took John Conyers out. But let's not forget, John Conyers, what kind of things did he do? One of the things that John Conyers did was he introduced a bill that said the United States cannot arm Nazis in Ukraine. He introduced that bill and it was passed. And up until recently, well, let's face it, it wasn't adhered to very long, but it was passed. They don't go by the rule of law. So John Conyers he was in the Out of Iraq caucus. He started the Out of Afghanistan caucus. He started. I knew John Conyers, a wonderful man, one of my mentors. And so John Conyers was a pretty genuine guy. He was an anti-imperialist. He was an anti-war guy. And so he was an enemy of the ruling class and the status quo. So he had to go also. Big union guy. All this, he was one of Martin Luther King's lawyers, in fact, and he was UAW, Detroit, great guy, really wonderful guy, funny as hell. So at any rate, so cancel culture is useful. So what happens now? How does it apply to foreign policy? As I said, it is the kissing cousin of U.S. foreign policy, because the U.S. says we have a rules-based order. It means the U.S. makes the rules and you take the orders. It means we don't. The rules-based order is put forward as an alternative to international law. And it just benefits the U.S. And you know what? I said a long time ago when they first started talking about it, I said, you know what I would ask if I was the foreign minister of another country? Okay, let's talk about the rules-based order. Where can I get a copy? I'd like to read over it. Because they'd have to immediately say, well, there is no copy. Well, then there is no rules. There are unwritten rules. Where did the rules come from? Where are they made? There are rules that we all go by, but I can't see them. I can't read them. You can't find them anywhere. Well, in other words, that's arbitrary. Who makes them? How do I know? How do I know I'm abiding by the rules-based order if they're not written anywhere? No, it was clearly this. Rules-based order was a term. It was a word. It was nothing else. It was a public relations term used to cover the reality that there were no rules. It was the opposite of a rules-based order. There are no rules. It's not based on anything, and it doesn't keep order. It maintains U.S. hegemony. That's what it was. And what has happened is in the international law, excuse me, in the international political, economical, and now military sphere, the rules-based order, which was about U.S. hegemony, has run headlong into international law, right? The other thing about it is, when you think about woke culture and rules-based order, they're used to smite your enemies or used to keep people in line who are on your side. That's all it is. The rules-based order, woke culture are tactics. They're not, but they're part of a greater strategy, but it's an informal strategy. that says I run things and I get things, get what I want. And that's where we are today. So let's talk about cancel culture. It's pretty absurd, and it is just like we're going to make you disappear, and it's a way to beat people in line, right? An example right now, a perfect example of cancel culture. What's going on with the Russophobia? Okay, things that to people like you and I, who expect some kind of a logical foundation, some kind of a logical argumentation or reason for the action. So when somebody does something, we can say, why'd you do that? How does it make the world better? How does it do anything? These things don't seem to make sense. For instance, recently we found that one of these, I don't know what it is, some association of space, whatever the hell, recently said the first man to walk in space was some Soviet cosmonaut. And because the Russians invaded, uh, you know, uh, uh, um, um, Ukraine, we're not going to recognize the reality of that. It's not that it didn't happen. We all know it happened, but we're not going to like have it up. We'll go to Smithsonian, we'll take it out of there, and we've got space museums that have a picture of this guy. Those all have to go, so forth. So that's not going to happen. Those are the kind of things they're doing. The Russian book, a book written by some Russian guy. Nope, we're going to pretend like he didn't exist. We're not reading his books. We're not teaching articles about him. That's cancel culture. We're going now. Here's the thing. Those guys are dead. It's not like you're canceling them. It's not like they're going to go, oh, darn. It's not like in the world of material reality, those things are going to make any difference. But in this broken culture that we have, I'm going to be honest with you, the culture is broken. Things that are real are not of consequence. It's a culture that now says we deal with things in the world that we create. And I once heard it said this: neurotics create castles in the sky, psychotics live in them. Our society has gone into a psychotic area where we now live in these magical castles in the sky, although it matters. And you cannot, you get canceled for discussing things that are valid, we have a valid reason to discuss. I don't care, I don't discuss anything. Let me give you an example. Now Kinky says failed state. I'll put it a different way. The US, we've got a beautiful culture. We got all kinds of music, don't we? We've got great art. We've got all kinds of foods, go places. I don't eat meat, but I have friends who are barbecue and they cook all kinds of delicious barbecue. I know people that are into art, the music, all kinds of wonderful things in the US that we do. And we got bluegrass, we got blues, we got hip hop, we got jazz, we've got rock and roll. I mean, we got some great music, all kinds of wonderful things about America, architecture, wonderful things about our culture and the people and comedians. Oh my gosh, some of the best comedians in the world, right? And if you think about it, we got all kinds of comedians too. You know, we got black comedians out of the kind of street, Dave Chappelle kind of black comedians. We've got your classic Jewish Jerry Lewis kind of comedians. We've got your, kind of redneck white guy. What's the cable guy? You know what I mean? We got people who take their particular culture and make it funny as hell. Those things are beautiful. We have a beautiful culture in the United States and a great culture. And so our culture hasn't failed. Our culture is beautiful and strong. However, let me make a different argument about the failure of a culture, because somebody asked me today, has our culture failed? The culture of the ruling elite class has failed. The ruling elite, Western ruling elite class has totally, their culture has crashed. And let me give you an example. The ruling elite class now decides, forget democracy, they decide who gets in power in office, right? Look around. Boris Johnson, Liz Truss. These people are clowns. These people are clowns. Now come over here. Joe Biden. Joe Biden, have you been paying attention to this guy? He's cognitively in significant cognitive declination. The guy's not doing well. Kamala Harris. Need I say anything about Kamala Harris? I don't even know what to say about Kamala Harris. She's about as bright as a wet match in a dark cave. Good Lord. I'm not saying she's stupid, but I'm just saying that she is not up to the task of being vice president of the United States. But in in our culture, in the culture of our ruling elite class, it didn't matter. In the culture of the everyday person, we'd be like, we want the best and brightest. We want somebody who's sharp and a leader and who looks out for the people. In the culture of our ruling elite, they want somebody who fits for certain check marks. And one of those check marks is not competence. They are not for competence. They want somebody who's going to maintain the status quo. Forget competence. They are against competence because a competent person may look at what's going on and say, why are we spending $15 billion to why are we sending $15 billion to Ukraine when it would cost $20 billion to end homelessness? And as soon as those missiles, and as soon as that stuff gets to Ukraine, the Russians are going to blow it to hell, which is what they do. They're like, go ahead and deliver it. We're blowing it up as soon as it gets here, and that's exactly what they do. So what's the point of sending that stuff other than to enrich the capitalist class who own these corporations that make the stuff? So the bottom line is we have an elite ruling class whose culture has collapsed. And now they put people in office who are the dimmest, most corrupt people that they can get their hands on. And now those people surround themselves with the neocons who are pure fascists. The Victoria Newlands of the world and all of those crews. The Victoria Newland was Dick Cheney's assistant. And we got a Jake Sullivan and these kind of people. So we've got incompetent boobs surrounded by pure fascists, militaristic fascists and psychopaths. That's what we have. So, and we didn't pick them. Don't fool yourself into believing that you picked them. Bottom line is this, and this is what people think when they think of interference with election interference. They think of the general election. I feel like more often than not, the election interference happens in the primaries. So in the end, we can get John McCain and Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, George Bush and John Kerry, George Bush and Al Gore. Some of them may seem to be a little different, but we get the same neoliberal warmonger corporate stooge. That's the choice they give you in the end. Which public relations person for the oligarch class do you want to choose? That's all you're going to get. So ultimately, the ruling elite, the woke culture and the cancel culture is just another indication of a ruling elite class whose culture has collapsed. They got nothing left. They don't know how to talk to us. They don't know how to act in a manner where they can even in any way, shape, or form anymore fool us into thinking that they're acting on our behalf. They don't even care. Recently, they passed a bill, and they're like, "We got to send arms to Ukraine." And people were like, "Well, there was COVID money for testing and things like that. What about the COVID money? Cut that out. We don't need that right now. We got arms to Ukraine. What about people here who are in food lines? Right now, there's Ukraine." They are focused on world hegemony, on full spectrum dominance around the world. They are focused on the needs of maintaining the world's preeminent empire. And you've probably heard me say this many times. An empire is kind of like a corporation. It takes on a life of its own. And when empires die, eventually what happens is this: all of the money and all the resources from the heart of the empire, the Emerald City, the green zone of the empire, right? They're living good because well, here's what happens. It's interesting. Think of it, everything going in, then everything going, I'm doing my hands like this. Everything's going in, everything's going out. Let's think of an empire. Think of a circle, right? That's where the people are. That's the main city. That's the United States, that has tentacles going out all over the world like an octopus in different directions, right? To Africa, to South America. It's bringing bananas. It's bringing coffee. It's bringing cacao for chocolate. It's bringing gold and radium and things from Africa. So you've got this America in the middle. You've got in the center, you have the empire, and it's drawing resources from all of these places to the center, and the people there are living good because they're stealing the resources from all of the people. They're overthrowing governments, they're killing them, they're installing puppet government leaders, they're doing it all. And this thing is, all these things are coming to the center, to the empire. At some point, the empire starts to reverse. And now it gets harder to draw those resources in, usually because other great powers in the world start to form. So now, before, the empire was sucking all the resources into the middle to the people in the empire, and they were living fat. It starts turning around. In order to maintain the empire, those tentacles out there, these countries in South America, these countries in Central America, in Europe and Asia, blah, 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 on the outskirts of the empire now, it's very expensive because you're being challenged. So now all the economic resources in the center of this octopus, right, in the center of the empire, start draining outwards. So an empire, think of it like a pulse. Here's your center of the empire, tentacles going in every different direction, right? So that's the center of it, like an octopus's head, and think of his tentacles stuck out in different directions. And one's in South America, and one's in Asia, and one's in Africa, and they're reaching, and they're sucking all the resources in. At some point, there are challenges from other world powers. There's other dynamics, and now all these resources that you have in the center of this kind of octopus start draining outwards, and it becomes the empire's resources have to be used to keep the outer edges of this empire afloat. That's where we are now. So now, when that happens, the people in the empire start getting angry. It happened in the Soviet Union. That's one of the things that happened. The people in actual Russia said, why are the people out in these outer edges in Poland and all these other stands and all these other countries, why are they living so good? They got new schools, and we're actually in the heart of Russia, and we got old ones, right? That's how it kind of fell apart. That's where we are now. All the money has to go out. I just saw the other day, $27.4 billion being spent to build a chain of missile bases surrounding China, so we can keep China at bay because they're challenging us. Then the US just bought for $300 million a port in the Philippines so they can build a base there for their ships and things of that nature, right? So all of this money is like Asia. Asia's draining the US. The resources in the center of the empire are going out. Africa, Russia and China are starting to do business in lots of business in Africa. The U.S. has to build AFRICOM to start that, to try to stop that. All these resources are going out there. South America. So now the resources, the people in the center of the empire who were living good are now in food lines. They're now homeless. They're now struggling, and they're saying, "What about me? I'm sick. I'm hungry." But the empire can't help them, because the empire has to drain all of the resources from the center to the outer edges of the empire, just to keep the empire afloat, just to keep the pretense that it is still an empire. And eventually it collapses, and that's that's the direction we're going in now. And one of the tools that they're using to maintain an illusion at home, an illusion amongst other allies, if you want to call them that. An empire doesn't have allies, it has vassals, is woke culture and cancel culture. It is, I'm going to put on a Black Lives Matter mask. I'm going to put on a multicolored rainbow flag shirt or something like that. And then I'm going to say, look at me. I'm going around the world to make the world a better place and to make it fair for everybody. And then I go bomb the hell out of these countries and steal their oil and occupy them. But I got to have a front. I got to have an esoteric story. The esoteric story is I'm doing it. Excuse me. The exoteric story, the outer story, the cover story is I'm doing it for the good of mankind. Remember, we're in Afghanistan for 20 freaking years, and we get ready to leave. We can't leave. Why? Because would you believe we're doing it to help the women's rights? We've been there for 20 years, bombing hell out of the country. And might I add, for those of us who know the history of Afghanistan, what you know is Afghanistan was a fairly liberal country. It had a socialist government that was aligned with the Soviet Union. Women wore regular clothes. Women went to school. It was kind of almost like a Western liberalized kind of country, but it was socialist and it was aligned with the Soviet Union. So the U.S. sponsored terrorists. One of the people that they sponsored, the U.S. sponsored, was a guy who was known to go around to places and throw acid in women's face because their face wasn't covered. He was a absolute jihadist madman. So the U.S. sponsored jihadis and religious extremists and helped to take a more liberalized government out of power in Afghanistan in 1978 and 79. So the U.S. was there to stop women's rights in 78, 79, and the Soviet Union came in as a result of us destabilizing the government, right? And then the US comes in, overthrows the government of Afghanistan in 2001, occupies Afghanistan for 20 years, and then says we can't leave. Why? Because of women's rights. So really, what was that? That was an excuse. That was a reason. That was a cover story. It had nothing to do with that. Because the cover story before was terrorism. It was we can't leave. Why? Because if we leave, it'll be an incubator for terrorism and they'll come home to get us. Well, that was the cover story. When that cover story fell through and people started saying, we got to get out of here, they needed a new cover story. It's women's rights. It didn't matter what cover story they used. What was Afghanistan really? It was a place to have CIA spy bases. It was near the Chinese border, the infamous area in China where the Xinjiang, where there was a Muslim population and the US was hoping to work out of there and to actually create jihadists and destabilize that portion of China. So we were doing the opposite of what we were saying. We had CIA bases to spy on Russia and China and all kinds of nefarious activities. So we had a cover story so we could be involved in the business of the empire, of maintaining an empire. And then suddenly, when we got out, Biden got out, and the bottom line was the cover story went, and they just said, what the hell, okay. Forget the terrorists and women's rights. Do you hear anybody whining about Afghanistan anymore? No. But the reason Joe Biden got out was because he wanted to focus on Russia and China. He wanted to go say, look, the problem we got now is these two emerging world powers, and we won't have full spectrum dominance in the world. So let's focus all of our energy on trying to destabilize these other world powers, which now you're talking about something that takes so much resources that it's just going to destabilize us. But psychopaths and sociopaths and fascists don't think like that. They can't see the forest for the trees. They got to go after Moby Dick now. There's a great white whale out there in Russia and China. Two of them. They're going after them both, and they're sinking the ship, and we're riding with it. But my point being, don't get caught up on talking about cancel culture as though it is a genuinely held belief that there are people who really believe they're doing the right thing with this cancel culture. It is a fraud. It's just another tool to smite your enemies. It's a way to say we can't have a discussion about whatever is or isn't reality. Let me give an example. There is a transgendered swimmer. And this person, the transgendered swimmer, is swimming with women who were born as biological females and winning by a mile, which is fairly obvious. And there are those who want to have a valid discussion about that. There are those who have some concerns, feeling that, what if we weigh the rights of the transgender swimmer with the rights of the biologically women swimmers who were born as biologically as women, who they certainly have a right to compete on a fair basis. Is the fact that the transgender swimmer was born a man, does that give them a physical advantage, and should that physical advantage be taken into account when we decide whether or not they can compete against women? Well, no matter how you feel about it, that's a reasonable and valid discussion to have. It's not like you shouldn't be able to have that discussion. It's a valid discussion. And people come down on both sides of the issue. And those who come down on either side of the issue, first of all, if it's a valid discussion, then you really shouldn't crush people that come down on either side of the issue. You should say, because I'm like this. I have my feelings about lots of things. I was a police officer for many years, and I'm a lefty. And so needless to say, I work with a lot of people, the most beloved friends that I worked with that were conservatives, a lot of conservatives. And we were fishing partners, and we were buddies, and we bowled, and went to games together, and we cavorted when we were young and drank brew and all the things that young guys do, right? And we disagreed politically. But that was okay because we respected each other, right? And I would just say, whatever, you guys are crazy. But we had fun times. So therefore, it's a sign of a healthy culture. That's what I'll say. It's a sign of a healthy culture when people who disagree can set their disagreements aside and see each other through the veil of humanity. That is something that's put aside. That is something that's unacceptable. Such as The issue of the transgendered swimmer. People should be able to have a conversation and say, in the end, I disagree. I don't think this person should be able to swim. Somebody says, I think this person shouldn't be able, shouldn't, whatever. And in the end, then they go drink a beer and watch the game if that's what they want to do. And that's that. Cancel culture says no. It says there's a side of good and a side of evil, and all we have to do is determine which side you're on, good or evil, and then we can move forward from there. And if you're on the side that is deemed evil, then you must be canceled. However, there's a caveat. If you are a person who's running for office against Donald Trump, whatever you do has to be ignored, and we'll adjust the rules depending on who it is. So even then, depending on who you are and whether or not you are of greater value to us, the rules that we have in cancel culture or woke culture can be adjusted. Well, if Joe Biden came out tomorrow and said, I don't think that the transgender swimmer should be able to compete with women, they'd overlook it. Well, he's the president and he's an older guy, and so we've got to take blah, 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 blah. If somebody young said it, they're going who's of the wrong party, of the wrong affiliation, etc. They're going to trash him. And in fact, when Joe Rogan, who they're hunting for, even says, let's have the discussion, they attack him for having the discussion, for something that's healthy. That's why I might add that Joe Rogan has so many people who want to watch his show. That's why Russell Brand has so many people who want to watch his show, because they're not afraid of those conversations. They're not part of the cancel culture, woke culture, not cancel, not woke. They're people who are saying, I'm a human being, and as a human being, I'd like to talk about things. I'd like to have a philosophical discussion, intellectual discussion. I always say an intellectual discussion doesn't mean you're smarter than anybody. It's not about processing power in the brain. An intellectual discussion is about how you arrive at your points and whether or not you respect the people that you disagree with. An intellectual discussion doesn't even mean that you read books all over the place. It just means that you're willing to listen to logical and reasonable argumentation, and you're willing to present it. And at some point, you're willing to say. So at times, people say, "Well, that makes sense, but I just can't. I don't agree. I can't agree with that. That goes against the way I feel about life." Yeah, it's okay too. Even if you don't like it, it's okay. Great. Let's go drink a brew and finish watching the game. Hooray! So that's why I wanted to talk to you tonight about cancel culture and woke culture, because I wanted to make sure you understood my perspective on seeing this whole woke slash cancel thing not as anything that's done for the good of our society, and not as anything that comes from the middle class, from the working class, the working poor, the poor. This is elite ruling class stuff. This is coming from Hollywood, places like that. This is coming from the New York elite, etc., the elite ruling class. And it is arbitrary. They and capricious. You always got to add that. It is a weapon that it's one of the tools, right? You've got your quiver and all of these arrows. What are we going to do? Let me pull this arrow out. You're a racist. Let me pull this arrow out. You're a sexist. Let me pull this arrow out. You're a misogynist. Now conservatives have theirs. Let me pull this arrow out. You're non-patriotic. Let me pull this arrow out. You don't love God. Let me pull this arrow. So basically, people have an arrow, have a quiver full of arrows, and rather than have a reasonable discussion and respect people who disagree with them, they pull out one of their arrows. Conservatives will do that. They'll pull out one of the arrows. You're a socialist. You're a fill in the blank. And part of that is this: label, right? And then discount. You are a fill in the blank. You're a socialist, you're a misogynist, or whatever. And once I label you as that, anything you say has to be disregarded. Once I give you a label, once I put you in a group, once I put you in a box, I have said you're a member of this group, and I've determined that everyone in this group is wrong and evil and should be discounted. Therefore, I don't have to listen to your logical, reasonable arguments. You're a Putin. There you go. You're kinky. Kinky's got it on boom. You're a Putin puppet. You're a Russian bot. Oh, and in the politics of culture, the politics of personality, all you got to do is tie somebody to a name, right? Oh, you're a Trump supporter. Well, Trump can be dead. They'll still call people Trump supporters, because Trump supporter doesn't mean you support Trump, really. It means you're a conservative, maybe, or I don't like you. People may have questions about. I've heard it with people. I had questions about COVID, because I was the person who questioned. Particularly, one of the things that I questioned was public policy related to COVID. I said some of these things don't make sense. Can I give you a quick example? There's a Nets game on the other night, the Brooklyn Nets, Kyrie Irving. You know the story with Kyrie Irving. Kyrie Irving's unvaccinated. Kyrie Irving, the team said you can't play here. The team said you can't come to practice. You can't be around our team because you're unvaccinated and they could catch COVID from you. The whole team caught COVID without him even being able to come into the facility. They were all vaccinated. They got it anyway, right? And then eventually, Kyrie Irving, they let him come back. Then we find out he can't come to the Barclays Center and play with the rest of his team in Brooklyn. But why? Because he's unvaccinated. He can play on the road, but he can't play his home games. But if you're a member of the opposing team and you're unvaccinated, you can still play. So if you're unvaccinated and you're on the home team, you can't play. But if you are on the opposing team and you're unvaccinated, you can play. Now I'm watching the game. He's sitting on the sideline. So now he can come to the game. The unvaccinated players on the opposing team can play. He can come to the game. He can sit on the bench. He can hang out at the game, but he can't get in the game. So when you look at that, you say to yourself, this is preposterous. This is an example of where we are. It makes no sense anymore. And I was a person who was during COVID, I would say, well, if a particular public policy doesn't make sense, I will question that public policy. And we were attacked as some kind of a crazy person because we would question public policy. And that's people would get, you know what people would say? I'd say, well, I don't know about some of these policies on whatever mandates. I opposed the jab mandates. I opposed it. I said, I don't know. It's a medical procedure. I don't think you should be able to mandate a medical procedure. And that's a valid discussion. It is and people said, well, however, it can protect people and protect your neighbors. And then the discussion was whether or not you could still transfer it, get the illness and give it to other people, whether or not you were vaccinated. So here's the bottom line. I'm saying all of those questions arose, which means it was a valid discussion. It was a valid, reasonable discussion with logical arguments on both sides. And if you kept going with it, you could get somewhere. But I had somebody say to me, you're a Trump supporter. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It didn't mean I supported Donald Trump. It was a name. It was name calling. Like, you're a pooper head. You're a jerk. You're a Trump supporter just meant when I hear that argument, I associate that with people who vote for Donald Trump, number one. Number two, Trump supporter is an expletive. You're a jerk, a moron, an idiot. And I just use that instead. You're a jerk, moron, idiot. But I say Trump supporter. And that's where we've gotten to. It's the politics of personality. It is you, you're a Putin puppet. What does that mean? Does that really mean that you work for Putin? You're spreading Putin's lies. Now it's Russian. Everything has to be canceled. That's Russian. Russian dressing. There's literally a sign outside of a restaurant in New Hampshire that says we're not serving Russian dressing until after this. Well, the Russians, sure, their feelings are hurt. Russian dressing wasn't even invented in Russia. It was invented here. It's like ketchup and some other crap to make a dressing, and they called it Russian dressing. Who knows? Maybe they were in a hurry when they made it. I don't know. But it's just foolishness. But it comes down. It's something that is put on us by the ruling elite class. It is not organic from the lower classes. It is not organic from the working class. It is not organic for the working poor, organic from the working poor, the poor. It's the ruling elite saying, go along with what we want. We want this person or don't want that person. And oh, by the way, we're going to associate everything with a name. We don't say Syria, we say Assad. And Assad is what? He's evil. We don't say Venezuela, we say Maduro. Maduro is what? He's evil. We don't say Russia, we say Putin. Why? He's evil. Let me give you an example of something. Speaking of cancel culture and how conservatives are right in there, the mainstream ones. Lindsey Graham said someone should assassinate Putin. Think about that. That's the ultimate cancel culture, assassination. But it's deeper than that. Think about why he said that, right? People who are international security analysts, if you ask them what's going on in Ukraine, they'll say, let's start in 2008. In, was it Budapest, I believe it was? I forgot where it is. Might have been Budapest, where the NATO first said, we're going to allow Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, and Russia said that's a red line. That's where that we would start. We would start right there. Then we go to 2014 to the coup and what's been going on. And we're going to give you a nuanced argument of how this happened. Doesn't have anything to do with Putin, right? Now, what is the mainstream argument? That it's Vladimir Putin wants to be the next god. That Vladimir Putin woke up on and said, "I'm in charge and I'm powerful and I'm going to do this because I want to build a new Soviet Union." That there is no nuance. There is no history. It has nothing to do with NATO's encroachment on Russia's border. It has nothing. We must ignore all the information, data, and logical argumentation about how this occurred and just say it's pure Vladimir Putin. Therefore, if it's nothing else but Vladimir Putin, that means if Vladimir Putin were canceled, then this war would go away because nobody else in Russia would do it. In fact, there is nobody else in Russia. There's Vladimir Putin, and he's an ultimate dictator, and everybody does what he says. Every single person just does what he says, right? And isn't it the same with Maduro? There's no government in Maduro. He's a dictator. Is it the same in Nicaragua? Daniel Ortega. There's no government. There's nothing. There's just a dictator. How about Syria? There's no government. There's just Assad. It is in the governments. What the U.S. says is there's a name, and that name is evil. And if we don't like you or we're angry at you, we'll associate with that name. Well, you're an Assad toady, whatever that means. And if Assad was gone, then there we go. If Putin was gone, was canceled, well, then Russia wouldn't have any concerns about the U.S. building bases all over their frickin' border. Who believes that? Who believes that? The people who are suckers, who are told this is about an individual, this is about a person, this is the politics of personality, not the politics of international security, the sphere of security around major powers. Not that Russia has concerns about threats on their border, not that we're building $27 billion worth of missiles surrounding China and China is going to have concerns about that. Not that the U.S. threatened to go to war with Russia because Russia was putting missiles in Cuba. And why did they put missiles in Cuba? How did the Cuban Missiles Crisis start? Because the U.S. put nuclear missiles in Turkey and pointed them at them. They put them in Cuba and pointed them at us. It's about countries. It wasn't about JFK and it wasn't about Khrushchev. It was about the sphere of influence and the feeling of border security on each of these two great powers. That's what this is about. I mean, the U.S. is really saying, hey, you know what? We stand with Ukraine. Where's Ukraine? Oh, it's 7,000 miles away. It's about our security interests. Where your security interests happen to be on the border of Russia, 7,000 miles away? Yes, it is, because that's what an empire becomes. And then all of the resources just drain out of the old empire. That's what's going on. That's why we're getting poorer. That's why everything's happening. The empire, it's all for the empire now. And now the people in the empire are irrelevant. In fact, we stand in the way of the empire because we're hungry and thirsty and we want decent jobs and healthcare and decent schools for our children and roads and decent transportation and things of that nature. Well, that's a problem for the empire. The empire can't afford that crap. It's got missile bases to build and to threaten its enemies. That's the reality of these things. So that's what I wanted to talk about: woke culture and cancel culture. Holy moly, it's after 11 o'clock. But, I had a good day and it was fun and the weather was good. And, I find this. President Putin is not a Gorbachev or Yeltsin. Putin is very much a nationalist. What people don't understand, they're like, he was with the KGB. But what did he do when he was with the KGB? He was counsel. He was a lawyer. He was a lawyer. So here's a guy that tends to be very much about going by the rules and international law and treaties and things of that nature. Big on that. And what happened in Ukraine? Well, it's fairly obvious. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? 2008. And Russia says, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, we're going to war. That ain't going to happen. And the U.S., ultimately, they even said, look, they don't have to be an official member of NATO, but if they're full of NATO bases, it's a de facto member. It's the same thing to us. It's not happening on our border. We would not allow Russia to start building bases on the Mexican border and to pump Mexico full of missiles and say, we're going to send lots of weapons to Mexico and point them at the U.S. We go to war, as China will, as Russia will, as all great powers will. That's the reality. And the censorship and propaganda is about what? That's what JMC, you are right. censorship and propaganda are about smothering the truth. It's about giving you a fraudulent argument. And so is and cancel culture. It's about canceling people who make arguments against things that maintain the status quo, that maintain the power of the power and the control of the rich and the powerful. And you will notice it's very self-serving. They're never going to use cancel culture to cancel a Joe Biden or a Nancy Pelosi or anything like that. It's going to be used to cancel a Garland Nixon. It's going to be used to cancel somebody who they already like. It is another tool that's used to smite people who are already their enemies. So, that's the fact of the matter. And I felt like, hey, why not get on here and chat and have a little fun? Let's look and see what other people have to say. Imperialism is coming home to America. America, we can feel it now. Absolutely, Kinky. The empire has turned inside out, as empires do. It's gone from grabbing all the resources and drawing them in, to now taking the resources inside and sending them out to the edges of the empire to try to maintain and fend off the empire. Look up Paul Wolfowitz's the Wolfowitz Doctrine that he said in 2001. It was quite simple. He said, look, we cannot allow any other country to threaten our, and I'm paraphrasing, world hegemony. No other country can do that. That's what this is about. 1998, a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, where he talks about it's called the Grand Chessboard, and he talks about we're going to break Russia up into a bunch of pieces. Let me be honest about this thing. The fact of the matter is this: Russia said, you guys are building up on our border. You're building missiles. You're building all kinds of things so that you can threaten us. And the NATO said, no, we're not an offensive, we're a defensive organization. We're building missiles and bases all around your border to protect us from you. And Russia said, no, we don't believe that. And in the end, here's the bottom line. If we're honest, Russia was right. I mean, come on. You got a book by a former Secretary of State that says, yes, we've got to break Russia up. And the way to do that is through Ukraine, with a literal book that was written talking about Ukraine's the key to getting Russia. And then we start building bases and doing all this stuff in Ukraine. Oh, no, we're not trying to get Russia. We wrote the book. It said that's how we're going to get Russia. And Russia's supposed to say, well, you guys did write a book that said you were going to use Ukraine to get us, and then you were going to tear us into several pieces. And you are taking Ukraine and filling it full of missiles and bases. But certainly, no, there's no harm, no foul. No, that's not the way it works. They were going to go to war sooner or later. And if we continue on China's border, they're going to knock us the hell off of there one way or the other too. You can be sure of that. I mean, for the I stand with Ukraine. The sad thing and the fact of the matter is, I mean, it's just a matter of time. Russia's going to knock us off the border. It wouldn't surprise me if because here's what I think. After Russia finishes the Ukraine project, shall we call it, they're going to send the U.S. and NATO another set of demands. They're going to resend them those demands, and they're going to say all those damn missile bases in Poland and Romania, we want them off our border. And I think, let's just say after this, that the NATO countries are going to start tearing at each other, because some of the NATO countries are going to say, no, we will not do it. And some of the other NATO countries will say, now, if you don't do it, the last time Russia said we need to demilitarize Ukraine and you said no, they went to war. So when they say get these missile bases out of Romania and these other places, if you don't do it, there's a strong possibility that they're going to take military action. And I think you'll have a fight in NATO. NATO is going to be torn apart because there are going to be countries that are going to say, I don't want this fight on Russia's border. Why should we be fighting on Russia's border just to keep bases on Russia's border? What's the point of going to war with Russia just to keep bases on their border? Why don't we back the bases off of their border and not go to war with them? Because here's the thing about it. Russia's military is very powerful. Very, very powerful. It's the most powerful military in spades in Europe. So if NATO says, no, we're not going to take these bases and missile batteries off your border, and Russia goes to war, Russia will win that. And they'll knock them off their border. But you're going to have a war. So the question is this: do you do it the easy way or the hard way? When Russia says, get these bases the hell off of our border, are you going to get them off, or are they going to knock them off? Do you really want to go to fight with a war with Russia? Is it one that, A, you're going to lose, B, it could go nuclear and then everybody loses? There's no way you win that one. So there are going to be realists And I suspect there's going to be now populations in Europe that are going to start to uprise and say, wait a minute, NATO was supposed to be here to make us safer. It ain't making nobody safer. So you're going to have some backlash, particularly the hungry ones in Europe, because all of these sanctions, the sanctions and the money are a whole nother story. But yes, Brian Cheney says, the Western empire is collapsing from the weight of its own average. Yeah, that's a fact. It is collapsing. It's definitely collapsing. And but the culture of the elite ruling class is what's collapsing. And now they're collapsing themselves economically. That's a whole nother story. That's a whole nother go round the bin, shall we say. And we're going to have that one too. I had a great radio show. Let's see. E. Walker says, didn't Russia have a very large amount of the Ukraine army surrounded years ago, and that's what got the Minsk agreement brought to the table to keep the Ukrainian army from being slaughtered? Yes, that's what happened in 2014, and it was, and the bottom line was the U.S. then decided, okay, we got our mitts on Ukraine, we're going to pump them full of weapons, and we're going to make them a de facto NATO member. And think about this: the Ukraine has NATO training, NATO uniforms, NATO weapons, NATO bases, but it's not a member of NATO. Recently, Russia hit a base where Poland, NATO was sending people and weapons into Poland. I mean, into Ukraine, into a base just inside 25 miles, 40 miles inside of Poland. Russia allowed them to load the base up with weapons, load the base up with people, and struck it with high power weapons and flattened the hell out of it and probably killed a couple thousand people, at least hundreds at minimum, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons were destroyed. Right. So the fact of the matter is, if we're honest with it, NATO is already kind of at war with Russia in that they're trying to provide their NATO trained and NATO armed troops in Ukraine with the means to fight Russia. Russia has, I've heard numbers anywhere between 15 and 30% of its military might in Ukraine, and they're going to win. And they're going to win inside of a month, 1 or 2 months, a month, 6 weeks, 6 weeks. And that's in a ground war. They didn't bomb it flat like the U.S. usually does. They used mostly ground tactics. And they didn't bomb the cities flat as the U.S. tends to do in the Middle East. So they're using a small percentage. Now, of course, the Western media says they're having a rough time and they're losing, but that's for Western consumption. And I understand that people who watch it, MSNBC and CNN and Fox and all that stuff are going to believe that stuff. But if you look at the facts on the ground, the issue is that the Russians are going to win it handily. I mean, this is the Ukrainian military is a bug on a windshield. If they really wanted to take them out, they could at any given time, but they don't want to. In my opinion, I'm just saying, I don't think they want to really blow the country to smithereens because they don't want to occupy it with so much. I do think they're going to break it up. I do believe they're going to break it up. In for a dollar, in for a dime, in for a dollar. I think Russia is going to say, since we had to go in Ukraine, we felt that we had to go into Ukraine, that we're going to leave Ukraine in a situation where we've got enough control that they ain't going to threaten us again. If we had to go in, we're going to make sure it never threatens us again. I think that's what the Russians are going to do. And they're on their border. They got enough power to do it. And trust me, Poland and these other countries know, in Romania and these other countries know, if Russia wanted, they'd crush them all like a flea. So I think when this is over and Russia starts saying, okay, let's talk about this other stuff, like you guys going to have to back off our border, one of two ways, I suspect it's going to happen. I think Russia has made the decision that they have an existential threat on their border, that NATO has become an existential threat, and that one way or the other, that if they don't fight now, that NATO will only build more bases and eventually have a bunch of nuclear stuff on their border, and they'll have to deal with that. And I think they've come to a point that they got to fight now or else. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I don't know. I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just saying that's international security, and the U.S. would do the same thing, and eventually China shall too. That's the way it is. So at any rate, at Garland Nixon on Twitter, Garland.Nixon on Instagram, Garland Nixon on Facebook, and I can't go, I'm I'll Facebook jail until the end of the month anyway. Who cares? And then of course on Twitter, I'm there, Garland Nixon on Twitter, at Garland Nixon, Telegram. And if you're watching this on Twitter, then please go to my YouTube channel and sign up. I'm starting to, the sign ups are starting to happen, and now I'm going to try to figure out how to set it up to get super chats. I got my Patreon so I can raise some money because I'm looking at this mixer that I want to get, right? And cool, and this is how cool this is. The mixer allows me to take phone calls. How cool would that be? If I get the mixer, I'll get another phone, get a phone with a phone number, a very specific phone number. And while I'm doing this, I might take some phone calls. How cool would that be? I'm going to get some interaction from some of my guests. And it's particularly when I do my show on Saturday morning and I have great guests, I might take some phone calls from my guests. So I want to get that mixer to set up. So I will figure out how to do the super chat thing and how to do, and I got my Patreon page set up so I can raise some money and I can expand my studio a bit and maybe expand my show. How about that? I think that'd be good. And I want to be able to get the equipment to do some show on scene, to be able to go out and cover some things. And in the wild, shall we say, in the wild, maybe I'll go to, like, one thing I'd love to do, there's going to be a April 11th, I believe. There's going to be an Assange thing, an Assange rally. And man, I'd love to cover that. So at any rate, for all my friends, and put that up here. Also, I had a great guest on my radio show in DC last night. I mean, Friday night, last night. Yeah. And he sent me, it was a great show. And he turned our show into a video, he changed the file format, bottom line, from MP3 to a video so that I could upload it to YouTube. So I'll get that all figured out and upload that to YouTube. How's that? All right. So thanks a lot. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and share all of my videos as much as you can on all of your platforms. My email is garlandin@gmail.com if you have any questions. Peace. Thank you.